When I first moved into the quiet riverside neighborhood, I knew that owning a house so close to the water came with certain risks, and I wasn't naive about it. Flooding had always been a part of this area's history, but I believed with the right preparation and foresight, I could keep my property safe. So when heavy rains were forecasted for the region, I spent an entire weekend hauling, stacking, and securing sandbags in a carefully constructed barrier around the vulnerable side of my home that faced the rising river. It was backbreaking work, done mostly by myself with some occasional help from a neighbor's teenage son, and though it left me sore and blistered, I went to bed that Sunday night with a measure of peace, knowing I had done everything within my power to protect not only my property, but the foundation of my family's home. Yet, when I stepped out the next morning to admire my handiwork and make sure no leaks had formed, my stomach dropped at the sight of dozens of sandbags tossed carelessly into the muddy street, the neat protective wall I had built destroyed as if someone had gone out of their way to undo it. And standing there smugly with her arms folded was none other than Karen, the president of the Homeowners Association, a woman who had long fancied herself the unofficial ruler of the neighborhood, barking orders about fence heights, flower colors, and what shade of curtains people were allowed to hang in their windows. She sneered at me and told me that my sandbags were unsightly and against HOA regulations because they disrupted the aesthetic integrity of the community, and when I tried to explain that they were a necessary precaution against the imminent floodwaters predicted by the local weather service, she cut me off and insisted that no such flooding would happen, that I was fearmongering, and that if anyone dared to follow my example, it would drag down property values. So, in her mind, she had every right to dismantle what I had built during the night while I slept, and as I stood there staring at the ruined barrier that had taken me hours to assemble, I felt a wave of anger and disbelief crash over me. Because not only had she undone my efforts, she had jeopardized my home and my family's safety, and all because of her obsession with appearances and her inflated sense of control. Yet, I bit my tongue and simply told her that she had made a terrible mistake, to which she laughed and dismissed me, strutting back to her oversized mansion at the end of the block, where her gleaming, pearl-white luxury car sat proudly in the driveway, a car I knew she babed more than anything else in the world, waxing it every weekend and bragging to everyone about its value, nearly $1 million after all the custom work she had put into it, and as I stood there seething, a small thought crept into my mind that maybe nature itself would be the one to teach her a lesson she so richly deserved. Because no matter how much authority she thought she wielded over the HOA, no amount of power or arrogance could stop a raging river once the rains came pouring down. That night the rain came harder than anyone had expected, sheets of water pounding against rooftops and flooding the gutters until they overflowed like miniature waterfalls spilling into the streets, and I stood at my window watching helplessly as the river began to swell, its dark surface churning with a restless energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, because I had seen this kind of surge before in other parts of the state, and I knew what was coming, but the difference was that this time I had been prepared, at least until Karen decided to dismantle the barrier that would have bought me precious hours, maybe even days, to fight back against the creeping floodwaters. Now, with the ground already saturated and the storm showing no signs of relenting, I could see rivulets of muddy water beginning to snake their way toward the base of my house. And I couldn't stop the mix of fear and fury that built in my chest as I realized just how reckless and selfish her actions had been. Yet in that same moment, a twisted sense of poetic justice began to form when I glanced down the street toward her mansion, where her $1 million car sat exposed in the driveway because her garage was cluttered with the endless junk she hoarded from her shopping sprees, a fact I knew because she bragged about her exclusive designer collections every chance she got. The irony was not lost on me that the same woman who destroyed my sandbag barrier because it was ugly had left her prized possession out in the open, gleaming beneath the sheets of rain like a beacon for disaster, and as I sipped my coffee with a grim sense of inevitability, I thought back to the smug way she had lectured me that morning, dismissing not just my efforts, but also the very real warnings issued by the Weather Service, insisting she knew better than everyone else because she was the HOA president and had lived in the neighborhood for 2 decades, as if tenure alone made her invincible. But nature is no respecter of egos, and within an hour the storm had escalated to a roar, lightning splitting the sky as thunder rolled so loud it rattled the glass in my window frames. The street had transformed into a shallow river, water rushing past at frightening speed, carrying sticks, leaves, and debris down toward the low end of the neighborhood. Exactly where Karen's mansion stood like a jewel on display, slightly downhill from most of the other properties, and I could already see the water beginning to pool around her front yard, swirling dangerously close to the tires of her car. I felt a pang of bitter satisfaction at the sight, not because I wanted to see someone's property destroyed, but because she had invited this upon herself through arrogance and cruelty, and the very thing she had mocked me for trying to prevent was now creeping toward her with unstoppable force, a wet, muddy truth that no HOA bylaw could argue away. So I grabbed my phone and began taking pictures, not just of my own yard, where the damage was visible and worsening thanks to the lack of a barrier, but also of her car, the water lapping higher every few minutes, because I knew she would try to twist this later, claim it wasn't her fault, maybe even accuse me of negligence, and I wanted evidence, concrete proof of what the storm and her vanity had caused. Around midnight, the power flickered, then went out completely, plunging the neighborhood into darkness broken only by the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the chaos outside, and in those fleeting bursts of light, I could see neighbors peering out from behind curtains, whispering to each other, probably realizing for the first time that the unsightly sandbags Karen had removed might have been the only thing standing between safety and disaster. But now it was too late, because the river had swelled to the point of overflowing, and as the hours dragged by, the water crept higher and higher, inching up Karen's driveway until it finally touched the bumper of her prized car, a moment I'll never forget, because it felt like the hand of fate finally delivering a lesson to someone who thought she was untouchable. And though part of me wanted to laugh at the irony, another part of me couldn't help but feel the weight of the night pressing in, because while her car was about to become a casualty of her arrogance, my own home was also at risk thanks to her meddling, and I would have to fight tooth and nail to keep the damage from being catastrophic. But for now, as I stood there in the darkness listening to the storm rage on, the sight of that car surrounded by rising water was a grim reminder that nature always gets the last word. By the time dawn broke, the storm had barely slowed, and though the rain wasn't as relentless as it had been during the darkest hours of the night, the damage was already irreversible. The streets transformed into swirling canals of muddy brown water that carried garbage cans, patio furniture, and even a few children's bicycles downstream with frightening ease. And as I opened my front door to inspect the situation, the humid, heavy air hit me like a wall, carrying with it the stench of wet, earth and sewage mixed together, the kind of smell that tells you the flood isn't just an inconvenience, but a looming disaster that will leave scars long after the water recedes. I waded ankle deep through the front yard, cursing under my breath at the sight of water already pressing against the base of my foundation, knowing that if my sandbag wall had been left intact, it might have at least delayed this, buying me enough time to redirect runoff and save thousands of dollars in damage. But thanks to Karen's arrogance, I was now left exposed, and the only thing I could do was move what I could upstairs and pray the water didn't climb too high. Yet even as I scrambled to protect what mattered most inside, my eyes couldn't help but be drawn toward the spectacle unfolding down the street, because there it was, Karen's $1 million car, her crown jewel, now half submerged in muddy water that was climbing steadily with each passing hour, the once pristine white paint job now streaked with dirt and debris, its custom rims vanishing beneath the surface as the current lapped at the doors. And though I knew I should have been entirely focused on my own property, I couldn't deny the grim sense of justice that radiated from the sight, because here was the very embodiment of vanity and pride being humbled by forces beyond her control. And as neighbors began to gather on porches and peek out from upstairs windows, I could see them all staring at her driveway, too, whispering among themselves, their expressions a mix of horror, disbelief, and, if I wasn't mistaken, a touch of satisfaction, because Karen had lorded that car over everyone for years, flaunting it at every neighborhood gathering, bragging about how much she spent on modifications, scolding children for coming too close to it with their bikes, even threatening legal action once when a delivery truck left muddy tire marks near her driveway, and now here it was drowning in the very flood she had assured everyone would never come. I could only imagine the rage boiling inside her mansion at that moment, because I had seen her the night before, standing in the window with her arms crossed as if daring the storm to challenge her authority. But no HOA title, no smug lecture, no arrogance could hold back the rising tide, and as the morning dragged on, the water only worsened, creeping up until it reached the hood of her car, then the windshield, leaving only the roof and mirrors visible, like a tombstone jutting out of the flood. And I'll never forget the moment Karen finally emerged, flinging open her front door with her phone clutched in one hand, her face twisted with panic as she screamed into the storm at no one in particular, demanding to know why the city hadn't sent pumps, why the drainage system hadn't been upgraded, why someone hadn't stopped this. As if blaming others would undo what nature had already claimed, she stomped into the water up to her knees, shrieking about her car, flailing her arms wildly as though yelling at the river might reverse its course, and I stood there on my porch, silently watching, every muscle in my body taut, with the effort of keeping my mouth shut, because though I wanted to scream back at her, to remind her that she had personally destroyed the barrier that might have diverted this water away from her property, I knew it would be wasted breath because people like Karen never take responsibility, they only deflect and accuse, but I also knew the neighborhood was watching too, everyone seeing with their own eyes the poetic justice of her arrogance unraveling in real time. And while some of them looked sympathetic, most just looked tired, tired of her tyranny, tired of her rules, and maybe, just maybe, a little relieved to see her finally brought down to the same level as the rest of us, because in the end, no amount of power or pride can save you when nature decides to remind you who's really in charge. And though I knew I still had a long, hard fight ahead to protect my home and salvage what I couldn't deny that the sight of her precious car vanishing beneath the floodwaters gave me the tiniest flicker of satisfaction in the middle of an otherwise devastating morning. As the morning wore on and the full scale of the flood revealed itself, the neighborhood descended into a strange mix of chaos and resignation, with some families frantically hauling belongings to upper floors while others simply sat in shock, staring at the water as though frozen in disbelief. And I was among the former, moving boxes of keepsakes and electronics upstairs, all the while cursing the fact that my sandbag wall, the one defense that could have slowed the water's assault on my property, had been dismantled by Karen's meddling hands. Yet every time I caught sight of her through the sheets of rain, wading back and forth between her front door and the driveway, her voice carrying over the storm as she shouted into her phone and screamed at neighbors, I couldn't help but feel that poetic justice was unfolding right before our eyes, because while we all suffered from the rising tide, Karen's pride and joy, her gleaming, custom-built, million-dollar car was being swallowed whole, each passing minute erasing another piece of it until finally, by late morning, it was completely submerged, only a ripple in the water and the faint outline of its roof visible beneath the murky surface. And though she shrieked and flailed, demanding that someone do something, the truth was clear. Nothing could be done, because no tow truck, no pump, no amount of HOA power could stop the flood from claiming what it wanted, and as much as I tried to stay focused on my own struggles, I found myself drawn into the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered on higher ground near the corner of the street, watching the spectacle unfold like a scene from a disaster movie, and the conversations that rippled through the group were telling. People who had once remained silent under Karen's thumb were openly muttering about her arrogance, recalling times she had fined them for trivial infractions, forced them to repaint fences, or threatened them with lawsuits over imagined slights, and now, as she splashed around in the rising water, mascara running down her face, shrieking about her car, and threatening to sue the city, the HOA, maybe even the Weather Service, the neighborhood finally seemed to see her for what she truly was. Not a leader, not a protector of property values, but a petty, self-absorbed tyrant whose vanity had led to her own downfall. Still, despite the bitter satisfaction that buzzed in the air, there was also tension, because Karen wasn't one to admit defeat quietly, and even in her humiliation she lashed out. screaming at me directly when she noticed me standing among the crowd, accusing me of setting her up by stacking the sandbags in the first place, claiming I had somehow tricked her into removing them so I could make her look foolish, a claim so ridiculous that the neighbors laughed openly, further fueling her rage as she stomped toward us, her soaked designer clothes clinging to her like a second skin, her fury radiating off her in waves. And in that moment, I realized that while the flood might have claimed her car, her pride was still very much intact, and she would not stop until she found a scapegoat to blame for her misery. I tried to remain calm, pointing out that the Weather Service had issued clear warnings, that the storm had been predicted for days, and that my sandbags had been meant to protect my home, not harm hers. But Karen was beyond reason, her voice hoarse from screaming as she declared that she would have my house condemned for improper flood prevention, that she would see to it I was run out of the neighborhood, and that no one would side with me once she was done filing complaints. Yet, as she shouted, I noticed something important. The neighbors weren't rallying behind her this time. They weren't nodding or agreeing out of fear. They were crossing their arms, shaking their heads, even whispering to each other in disbelief at her audacity. And though I didn't say it aloud, I could feel a shift happening right there in that muddy street, a quiet but undeniable turning of the tide against her authority, because for the first time, everyone could see with their own eyes the consequences of her obsession with control, and while the flood continued its relentless advance, damaging all of our homes and lives, the symbolic destruction of her car served as a reminder that her power was not absolute, that she could not control nature, nor could she bully people into ignoring the truth forever. Still, I knew better than to think this was the end of it, because Karen wasn't the kind of person to quietly accept a lesson, and as she stormed back to her house, dripping wet and muttering about lawsuits, I couldn't help but feel a chill that had nothing to do with the storm, because I knew that once the waters receded, she would come after me with every ounce of spite she could muster, and while part of me welcomed the fight, another part knew that the real battle, the one for survival, for repairing my home and protecting my family, was only just beginning. The hours after the peak of the storm were some of the most exhausting of my life, because while the rain finally began to taper off, the swollen river showed no sign of retreating, and the neighborhood was left in a state of half-drowning limbo, where people shuffled through waist-deep water to check on one another, passing out bottles of drinking water and flashlights, while others simply huddled upstairs waiting for the current to calm. But even in that grim atmosphere of shared struggle, Karen found a way to make herself the center of attention, her voice ringing out above the quiet murmur of neighbors trying to assess the damage, her accusations cutting through the soggy air as she declared over and over that it was all my fault, that my sandbags had been an illegal hazard, and if I had not stacked them in the first place, the flood would never have shifted toward her mansion, as if my modest row of sandbags had somehow rerouted an entire swollen river. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of her claims, but the rage in her eyes was no joke, and I could feel the venom in every word she hurled my way as she vowed to report me not only to the HOA, but to the city authorities as well, promising that once the insurance adjusters came, she would make sure I was labeled negligent and financially responsible for the damage to her car, her house, and perhaps even her pride, which she wore like a crown, even as her mascara-streaked face betrayed the reality of her unraveling. Composure. The neighbors who listened to her tirade shifted uncomfortably, some rolling their eyes, others openly muttering that she had lost her mind, but none stepped forward to defend me, not because they agreed with her, but because they were too exhausted, too broken by the flood's damage to their own homes to want to become the target of a wrath, so they simply turned away, focusing on hauling wet rugs upstairs, rescuing sodden pets, or trying to reach family members on dead cell phones, leaving me to bear the brunt of her fury alone. I stood in the water, my jeans heavy and clinging to my legs, my arms folded as I stared back at her, refusing to cower even as she jabbed a finger in my direction and screamed that I was finished in this neighborhood, that I had dared to challenge her authority, and now I would pay the price. And though I kept my mouth shut, my silence seemed to enrage her even more, her shrieks echoing across the block, until finally she stormed back into her house, slamming the door hard enough that even over the sound of rushing water, the impact reverberated through the flooded street. I let out a long breath, my chest tight with frustration, because I knew that while nature had dealt her a blow, it wasn't enough to stop someone like Karen. If anything, it had given her more reason to lash out, to scheme, to use the very systems of bureaucracy she thrived on as weapons against me. And as I trudged back to my porch, exhausted and cold, I thought about how unfair it all was. I had worked tirelessly to protect my home, only to have my efforts undone by her vanity, and now, instead of recognizing her mistake, she was doubling down, twisting reality so she could place the blame squarely on me. Still, a part of me couldn't help but feel that her threats rang hollow, because the neighborhood had seen the truth with their own eyes: the sandbags, the warnings, the forecast, the flood, the car vanishing beneath the water, and no amount of paperwork or HOA fines could erase the memory of Karen standing knee-deep in filthy water, screeching about her luxury car as the rest of us fought to keep our family safe. Yet knowing Karen, she would knock on doors, file complaints, flood inboxes with angry emails, and drag me into hearings meant to humiliate me, because that was the only way she knew how to survive, not by accepting reality, but by reshaping it into a narrative where she was always the victim. And as I climbed the steps to my porch, dripping and shivering, I made a quiet vow to myself that I wouldn't let her win, that when the time came to defend myself, I would be ready with photos, with witnesses, with the truth itself, because if Karen thought she could bury me beneath her lies the same way the flood had buried her car, she was in for a rude awakening. When the skies finally cleared and the waters began to recede, the true scale of the devastation revealed itself, and the neighborhood looked more like the aftermath of a war zone than a once pristine riverside community, with mud coating every surface, debris strewn across yards, and cars left in twisted, waterlogged positions that made it hard to believe they had once been parked neatly in driveways. Yet, despite the exhaustion that clung to everyone, there was an undeniable sense of unity as families emerged from their homes to help one another, carrying ruined furniture to the curb, sharing generators, and trading bottled water and canned goods. But as expected, Karen was the one exception, for rather than joining in the cleanup, she marched around the block with a clipboard in hand, soaked designer clothes replaced with an ill-fitting tracksuit and rain boots that were caked in mud, her voice sharp as she lectured neighbors about how they should be documenting everything for the HOA records, even though everyone knew she was less concerned about helping and more concerned about cataloging grievances she could weaponize later. Her mansion had taken significant damage, though not as severe as some of the smaller homes downhill, but her focus was entirely on her drowned luxury car, which by now sat ruined and rusting in the driveway, its once bright white paint dulled to a grimy gray, the leather seats inside warped and reeking from the water that had filled the cabin, and she couldn't stop pointing at it as she wailed to anyone who would listen that this was the fault of that reckless man with the sandbags, claiming I had single-handedly redirected the flood to her property, a claim so ridiculous that even the insurance adjuster who came later raised an eyebrow and made notes while struggling not to laugh. Still, Karen pressed on, cornering him, waving her arms, and demanding that my name be put into his report as the responsible party. And when he finally excused himself and came to inspect my property, I showed him the photos I had taken, the neatly stacked barrier, the wreckage I had found next morning, and even a few distant shots of Karen herself standing smugly with her arms folded as the sandbags lay in the street. And though he didn't outright say it, the small smirk he gave me before jotting down his notes was enough reassurance that the evidence spoke louder than her shrill voice. But of course, Karen wasn't done, because later, that same afternoon, as neighbors piled their ruined belongings on the curb, she gathered a small audience on her lawn, standing on a plastic crate to make herself taller, and delivered a tirade about how the HOA would be issuing citations to anyone who had put up unauthorized flood defenses, her eyes boring into me with every word, declaring that unsanctioned structures had not only ruined the neighborhood's aesthetic, but also compromised safety, as though sandbags were some kind of malicious weapon instead of a basic form of protection. And while many neighbors ignored her, rolling their eyes or returning to their work, a few weary faces turned to me, silently asking if I was going to respond. But I stayed quiet, letting her rant, because I knew that the louder she screamed, the less people took her seriously, and in the quiet conversations that followed behind her back, I heard more than one neighbor say that perhaps it was time to call for a new HOA election, whispers that made me smirk despite the mud caked on my shoes and the exhaustion weighing down my bones. Still, I wasn't naive. I knew Karen wouldn't stop, that she would escalate her fight in official ways, and sure enough, later that evening a letter appeared taped to my door, soaked and smudged from the damp air, but still legible enough, that claimed I was in violation of HOA Regulation 14.3, unauthorized modifications impacting neighborhood safety, and that a hearing would be scheduled to determine fines and possible liens against my property, a laughable attempt at flexing authority at a time when half the neighborhood was uninhabitable and everyone else was just trying to figure out how to dry their walls before mold set in. But the letter was proof that Karen's obsession hadn't drowned with her car, and as I crumpled it in my fist, I felt the spark of determination ignite in me again, because if she thought she could turn my act of preparation into a crime while ignoring her own reckless interference, she was about to learn that I was far more resilient than she realized, and at this time, I had the entire neighborhood and the undeniable truth on my side. The HOA hearing was scheduled a week after the waters had finally receded, and though most of us were still knee-deep in cleanup, ripping out soaked drywall, airing out warped wood, and fighting back the creeping mold that threatened to claim everything, Karen insisted the meeting go on, summoning the board members to gather in the community center like it was some grand trial where she would finally get to brandish her authority once again. And I arrived prepared, not just with the photos I had taken of my sandbag barrier before she tore it down, but also with printed weather reports, neighborhood text alerts, and even statements from a few neighbors who had quietly told me they were willing to back me up if Karen went too far. The community center smelled faintly of mildew, the chairs squeaked as people shifted uncomfortably, and Karen stood at the front like a judge presiding over her own court, clutching a thick folder of papers that she slammed onto the table as though the sheer weight of it would prove her case, her eyes darting to me with a gleam of triumph that made my stomach twist, because I knew she believed this was the moment she'd destroy me, that once the board heard her accusations, they would vote to fine me into submission or even place a lien on my home, forcing me out of the neighborhood entirely. But what she hadn't counted on was that the flood had changed people, literally and figuratively, when she launched into her speech, her voice rising to shrill heights as she described my sandbag wall as reckless, unauthorized, and directly responsible for the destruction of her car and property, complete with exaggerated hand gestures and references to obscure bylaw clauses. The audience didn't nod along the way they used to. They shifted uncomfortably, some crossing their arms, some shaking their heads, and when she presented photos of her ruined car, framed as evidence of my supposed negligence, there was a murmur of disbelief because everyone in that room had seen the storm, they had lived it, and they knew as well as I did that no sandbag wall could redirect the force of a river. When she finally finished her monologue, breathless and red-faced, the board turned to me, and I calmly laid out my evidence, placing the photos of my intact sandbag barrier in front of them, followed by the photos of it scattered across the street the next morning with Karen standing nearby, arms crossed and smirking, the proof as undeniable as the storm itself, and as I explained how the barrier had been intended only to protect my home, citing the Weather Service's flood warnings and my right to protect my property, I could see the shift happening right there at the table. The board members leaned forward, nodding slightly, while the neighbors in the audience muttered to each other, some even whispering loudly enough for Karen to hear words like "she destroyed it herself" and "she caused this." And I knew then that her stranglehold over the neighborhood had finally cracked. Still, Karen wasn't done. She interrupted me mid-sentence, screeching that my photos were doctored, that I had staged them to frame her, and when the board asked if she had any proof of such claims, she floundered, waving her hands wildly, shouting about how everyone knew she was always right, how she had been president for 20 years and her word should be enough. But the room had turned against her. The collective exhaustion and resentment of years of petty fines and power trips boiling over into open contempt, And when one of the neighbors finally stood up, an older man who had once been fined by Karen for leaving his trash bin out too long, and said loudly, "We all saw the storm, Karen, and we all saw you tearing down his sandbags," the room erupted with murmurs of agreement, voices rising as others chimed in with their own grievances, until the board had to call for order just to proceed. And in that moment, Karen's face, twisted in rage and disbelief, like a queen who had just realized her subjects no longer bowed to her, the board deliberated quietly for a few minutes before announcing that not only would I not be fined, but the HOA would be reviewing its bylaws to allow for reasonable emergency measures like sandbag barriers in the future, a statement that brought a wave of applause from the audience. Though Karen stormed out before it was even finished, slamming the doors so hard they rattled on their hinges, her shrill voice echoing down the hall as she screamed that this wasn't over, that she would take me to court personally if she had to, and while a chill ran down my spine at the threat, I also felt a strange sense of relief because for the first time since moving into that neighborhood, I knew she no longer held the power she once wielded, and though the flood had taken much from us all, it had also swept away the illusion that Karen was untouchable, leaving behind the truth for everyone to see. She had destroyed her own defenses, she had doomed her own car, and in the end, her arrogance had finally drowned in the very waters she claimed would never come. In the weeks that followed the hearing, the neighborhood began to stitch itself back together, slowly but surely, with the sound of hammers, saws, and generators replacing the roar of the storm, and there's a strange sort of camaraderie that bloomed in the aftermath as neighbors who had barely spoken before now worked side by side to haul out ruined carpets, rebuild fences, and scrub away the thick layers of mud that clung stubbornly to porches and driveways, and though the scars of the flood were everywhere, there was also resilience, the kind of resilience that comes when people realize they've survived something together. But while most of us were focused on rebuilding, Karen was unraveling, her fury feeding on itself like a fire with no wood left to burn, because with her car ruined beyond repair and her credibility shattered at the hearing, she no longer strutted through the neighborhood like a queen inspecting her subjects. Instead, she stalked from house to house, still trying to spread her version of events, still insisting I was to blame for everything, but now, instead of nods and fearful compliance, she was met with slammed doors, tired glares, and neighbors who had finally found their voices, some even laughing openly when she threatened lawsuits or fines, because everyone knew her power was gone, eroded just as surely as the riverbank had crumbled under the flood, and the final nail in the coffin came when the insurance company sent their official reports. Mine cleared, hers denied, citing evidence that her property had been left vulnerable due to her own removal of the sandbags, a line that spread like wildfire through the community, whispered in backyards, and chuckled over beers, until even those who had once been too timid to oppose her began openly mocking her arrogance. I saw her one morning, standing by the rusted husk of her $1 million car as a tow truck finally hauled it away, her eyes glazed, her mouth set in a hard line, and though part of me almost felt pity, the memory of her standing smugly in the rain after tearing down my defenses washed away any sympathy, because the truth was simple. She had brought this on herself, and the flood had only exposed what was always there, a woman so obsessed with control and appearances that she destroyed her own protection just to preserve her ego. The HOA board, emboldened by the uprising at the hearing, called for a vote not long after, and though Karen fought tooth and nail to maintain her presidency, waiving bylaws and threatening lawsuits, she was ousted in a landslide. Her reign ended not by force, but by the collective will of the very people she had tormented for years, and for the first time, the neighborhood felt free, no longer shackled by her endless fines and her suffocating obsession with aesthetics, but instead united in a desire to rebuild and protect one another from the next inevitable storm. As for me, I patched my home as best I could, filing my own claims and spending long, sweaty days ripping out rot and replacing what could be saved. And though the work was grueling, there was something deeply satisfying about knowing I wasn't doing it alone anymore. Neighbors dropped by to lend tools, share meals, or just talk about how things might be better now that Karen's grip had been broken. And in those quiet moments, I realized that sometimes it takes a disaster to expose the truth, to wash away the illusions people hide behind, and While the flood had taken much from me, time, money, and peace of mind, it had also given me something in return. A sense of belonging, a community forged not by Karen's false authority, but by shared struggle and resilience. Karen, meanwhile, retreated further into isolation, her lawsuits fizzling as lawyers turned her away, her threats growing weaker, until they were little more than angry mutters shouted from behind her curtains, and eventually rumors spread that she was planning to sell her mansion, unable to stand the humiliation of being just another homeowner instead of the self-appointed queen she had once believed herself to be. And though part of me knew she would never truly change, I couldn't help but smile at the thought of her leaving, because in the end, the river had taught her a lesson no one else could deliver. That pride cannot stop the tide, and arrogance is powerless in the face of nature's wrath. Standing on my porch one evening, the air still damp with the scent of river silt and fresh-cut wood, I looked out at the neighborhood. Children laughing as they rode bikes through puddles, parents chatting as they leaned on shovels, the sound of hammers ringing in the distance. And I realized that though the storm had nearly broken us, it had also swept away the poison that had lingered here for years, and in its place, something stronger had taken root, something Karen could never control, something that would outlast even the fiercest flood. A community that had finally learned how to stand together, even against the most powerful storm.